She was eating at some point like 2 to 3 pounds of meat a day in one sitting. And a lot of people were like, it's going to rot your kidneys. It's going to rot your liver, all the perceptions about meat. And there's arguably no better test to see, kidney function, liver function, and histology than an MRI, especially this technology. It's a diffusion weight imaged full body MRI. And so, obviously, we went there, no issues with liver, kidney, no buildup of iron, virtually zero visceral fat on my wife.
Les humains à leur meilleur.
C'est tu apogeo.
Peak ningen.
O melhor humano.
Keto Carnivore.
Welcome back, everyone. We're nearing the end of the season. Christmas is coming up. I'm actually waiting for my Uber right now to go to the airport to go home to Hawaii, and I'll be working on Food Lies with my director in person. His name is Jay. He's an amazing director. He just shot the Terra Couture piece that you saw on YouTube, and if you didn't see it already, please go to the Food Lies YouTube and watch the piece on Terra Couture. She's such a beautiful person, and it was shot well. This is a preview of the Food Lies film that I didn't really want to give out, and neither did Jay, but I thought it would be a good idea to let people see what we were up to, because it is taking a while. On to the episode. I recorded this with Mike Mutzel, who is an awesome guy. He was in Seattle, and I had a chance to catch up with him while I was there. I swooped in, swooped out, barely made my flight, like I'm about to barely make this flight. But he's so great. We got to feed his backyard chickens and pigs. We got to talk about all kinds of things about metabolism and fasting. And I have so many more questions for him, but maybe I'll have to have him back on again because we were too rushed. You can get his full background in the show notes. I'm going to get his stuff wrong, so I'll just link to it. Now on to the quick announcements. You can get your nose to tail meat at nosetotale.org. We have all kinds of stuff there, like primal ground beef with the organs mixed in. We have high omega-3 chicken and pork. If you like those foods, but they have too high omega-6 fatty acids, you can get them with our special feed that makes them high in omega-3. You can also get some of these things at your local farmer's market, so please don't have it shipped if you don't need to. Please support us on Patreon. We continually add extended show notes there, and I'm going to be adding some more videos up there soon. Thanks so much, everyone, for all your support. Follow me at Food Lies on everywhere, including YouTube. Here's the show. Well, we're live with Mike Mutzel, Metabolic Mike. What's up?
Hey, buddy. Thanks for coming out. Great
Thanks
to be
for
with you.
having me, man.
Yeah.
It's really cool that I got to come up and do an in-person podcast for Peak Human. I rarely do this.
Nice. It's better, right? I mean, you don't have to worry about tech issues or whatever. It's better to see people in the person, but
it's so much better. We can talk over each other more.
I know, right? Can anticipate. Yeah.
No, usually I let other people talk and I'm very quiet and just, but this is great. So we got to see your chickens and pigs.
Yeah.
Tell me what's going on. I love that you're kind of near the city, but you have this country vibe.
Yeah. So just a little context. So we're in Kirkland, Washington. If people go to Costco, they're familiar with Kirkland Signature and stuff like that. So we're just outside of Seattle, 6 miles. So I have a business and a kid and everything like that. But I really feel that food quality is super important. So kind of the impetus to have the backyard chickens, and it's kind of, I don't have a tattoo, but I understand like once you get one tattoo, they just, you get so many of them. And so animals are kind of the same way, at least for me. We started out 4 years ago now with like 3 chickens, and then we got 2 more and then 2 more. Now we have 16 or so. We had turkeys too for a while, and then we slowly will process one here and there when they get big enough. But interestingly, the turkeys grow much slower. Like when you give them non-GMO food and let them free range and do all that, compared to like, on Thanksgiving, a lot of people have these turkeys that are massive, right? And, anyway, so and then we got pigs about a year ago, and we're going to process them before Christmas. So I part of it is my daughter's an only child. I feel that part of how I got into health was through gut health and the whole microbiome thing and all that, which we can dive into if you want. But I think it's really important for kids to be exposed to microbes, and the feasibility of me traveling to a farm and having her hang out and theoretically maybe get exposed to microbes was slim to none in terms of, because it's just not time efficient. So I was like, well, how can we emulate that environment here at home within the confines of like a city? That's what we do. And part of it, I could probably grow my business and all this stuff faster without all these distractions, but it keeps me grounded. From a circadian rhythm standpoint, I'm up at, 6 in the morning. I have to feed them, let the chickens out. I'm just more connected with the seasons. It's good for my daughter to get out there. So it's fun. And plus we get, eggs all the time. Interestingly though, this time of year, they're not laying at all. Like the last few days I haven't laid at all. So when the days get chickens are really influenced by the sun and sunlight and sun exposure. So yeah, it's been kind of interesting to think about. So then, I naturally we just don't eat eggs like during, end of November through January. And then when they pick it back up, then we'll start eating them again, So part of it is, for food, part of it's lifestyle, part of it's just for fun,
I love it. No, that's so great. It's so great. There's so much more to the nutrition than just what you eat. And then you're doing it with the food, but you're talking about circadian rhythm. You're talking about microbes. You're talking about all this stuff. So yeah, I mean, keep going. Like I love that you're exposing your daughter to that early.
Well, and then also like making her tough and making her realize that like, this is where food comes from. And before we had the animals, she would just say, oh, I'm done with this. It doesn't taste good. It's not cooked right. Let's just throw it away. And now she knows like nothing gets thrown away. Either it gets composted or now that we have pigs, like they'll eat damn near anything, banana peels. I mean, you name it, they'll eat it, which is pretty funny. So, it's pretty fun just being resourceful and then giving her little responsibilities, so she has to get the eggs at night and help me clean the coop. And it's been fun, So I think you hit the nail on the head. I mean, you travel to like South America, right? We were just in Chile and we were talking about this, this is how people live, right? Maybe not in LA or New York, which you can, that's pretty artificial and contrived, if you will. But this is how humans lived. And I think this is where a lot of people are looking for the magic supplement, the magic exercise program. But I think if a lot of us just did some of the basics, we'd be so much more healthy and fulfilled. To be honest, I used to suffer from depression and, seasonal affective disorder and things like that. So I'm sensitive to those things. And I'm not saying chickens cured those, but just being more in touch and having purpose and meaning and being connected to your environment, I think does a lot for mental well-being too. So yeah, it's much more than, I think it's a lifestyle. And a lot of people make an excuse, well, I don't have time for this. Well, you just make time. You just do it, right? So yeah, I mean, I have a, 6-figure business, I have a family, I have all this stuff, but it's like, I just make time to make it happen. I could order my food off the internet like most people do nowadays, but that's more trash. It's more waste. It's just, it's not good for the environment. It's not good for your body. So.
No, I appreciate that. And Tara Couture, who we also talked about, Slow Down Farmstead, try to bring her up on every podcast.
She's awesome.
No, she taught me a lot of this stuff and over the past year and I saw it. I got to visit her farm and growing it and living it and that there is time, right? Like she's talking about a journey where she's at the end of the journey, right? It's like you can't do better than she's doing. She's doing everything by hand. Everything's organic. Everything is the most nutrient dense, perfect thing of all time. And then you're on that journey too. You're where I want to be, right? You have your own chickens and pigs and you're doing it. So, but everyone's on that journey and you don't get there immediately. Like first it's like, oh, I'm just going to buy grass-fed beef from Costco. So you're still at Costco, but at least you're getting the grass-fed version. And then, you go down this rabbit hole.
100%. And I that's a really good point that I think is helpful to underscore or emphasize. Not to talk about myself or anything like that, but like how I started was just taking the buns off the burger, and my stepmother got into the whole Atkins things. This was like the late 90s, and so I struggled with a little belly fat. And I thought, well, why not just start there? So I would still go to Wendy's or McDonald's, in high school, but I would just take at least one piece of the bun off, or if not the whole bun, And so, yeah, it definitely does start with that. And then I feel like as you get healthier and you become more aware of the subtle changes, like what a poor night's sleep does for you, or, what fast food does for you, or anything, you start to realize you get more in tune with your body. So I think, a lot of people are their state of ill health is such that they don't really notice the small fluctuations. And as you get healthier, you realize like, wow, this really impacts me in a negative way. Like I used to be able to drink a bottle of wine at night and it was no big deal because I didn't know what it felt like to get a good night's sleep. Now, if I have even 2 glasses of wine, I'm like, oh my gosh, I totally feel it. So I think, once you hit it's like there's different expressions, but once you start to feel what healthy feels like, over time, then you really can make the time and the effort to make these sweeping lifestyle changes, because you know what it feels like to be super healthy, right? And so you don't want to go back and just, some people just let loose on Thanksgiving and have bread and this and that. And, maybe they don't really notice it, but if you or I were to do that, we would feel like crap the next day. And so that's why we're going to take the extra effort to get good food. So yeah.
That is a turning point, and that's when it happened for me a couple of years ago, when I finally felt the difference. Then
Yeah.
And my brief story is I had overuse injuries on my wrists and from the computer for like 9 years, and I just thought, this is my life. I just can't use the computer much. I just switched careers. I was a mechanical engineer before, and I couldn't do that anymore. But then I was like, oh wow! Once I really got fat adapted and really took out all the grains, it just went away.
Interesting. I've never heard that. I mean, I've heard a lot of like overuse injuries in the hands, but the connection between the diet as well, that's super powerful.
Well, and I didn't believe it really. I was kind of like, did this go away? And then a couple of years ago at the Super Bowl, I had a party and I did exactly what you just said and went crazy and ate all the chips and breads and everything. And I came back.
Interesting.
And, I kept eating it. I had it all left over my house, and I ate it for a couple more days, and it came back, and then I stopped, and it went away.
Yeah.
So,
well, I think it's a really good lesson for people, and that's where you get the intrinsic motivation to make the changes, right? Because if you're like, let's say you have a girlfriend or a spouse or a family member, right? Trying to tell them like, hey, you need to change your diet because of this. If they don't have some compelling reason, or if they don't feel that intrinsic motivation because like that aha moment that you had, it's going to be hard to convince them, right? And so I think that's where I like, and I think agree with this, biomarkers and things like that, blood glucose, blood ketones, heart rate variability, so that if people are listening and they have a spouse or friend or family member that just won't change their diet, giving them something objective, for you is ostensible, is right there, palpable, tangible. But for some people, it's just like they don't get good deep sleep and they don't even know it because they're not tracking it. So things like the Oura Ring, there's people that say like, oh, it's just all about calories, just eat, whatever, stay in a deficit, where you're like, well, what about your glucose? What about your biomarkers? They often don't track those things. And I think I'm biased, of course, but I think that's why the ketogenic diet and going carnivore is so successful, is because for the first time in people's lives, they're tracking real-time feedback about how their body's responding to the foods that they're eating. And they're like, holy crap, like, if I have a bender on a Super Bowl or Thanksgiving, that really throws my glucose into a train wreck. So yeah, it's important.
It is. And I want to hear some of your story too. It's like, how did you get into this? And I know you had, some reasons for your own why you got here.
Yeah, gosh. I mean, it started, I don't know how far we want to go back, but I kind of had two aha moments. One was in high school. I was exposed to drugs and alcohol at a very early age due to an older sibling. So my brain was just like, I got arrested twice before the age of 15. Academics was really challenging for me, and I needed to like clean up my life basically. And so I realized early on the connection between diet and how I felt. But thankfully it was mentors. My stepmother introduced me to a chiropractor who helped me learn how to lift weights. And I started, teaching myself weightlifting, reading bodybuilding books and magazines, in high school. My uncle was like, hey, after you work out, you have to have a protein shake. I didn't know what whey protein was. And this is going back to the late 90s. And so I noticed that, wow, I changed my diet. It changed my body, but it also changed my brain. So I became super fascinated with that, and then went to school, went to college, got a degree in biology, and wanted to go to medicine and stuff like that. Was pre-med, but in college, I hurt my back, and I was really into weightlifting and everything like that. So the only high intensity exercise I could do was bike cycling. So I joined the bike team at Western Washington here in Bellingham, about an hour north of here, and started overtraining. Got really low testosterone, had GI issues and all this from just overexercise. And I was actually, it's kind of a funny story. I was working at a vitamin store and taking a lot of soy protein because it was the cheapest protein I could get. Again, my uncle got me on protein when I was like 14. But I couldn't afford the whey because whey is super pricey even back then. And so I started taking a bunch of soy protein, and man, like for the first time in my life, I got super depressed. Like I remember one Saturday in January, I think it was 2004, 2005, I could barely get off the ground. Like I was so weak, so anemic. And so I went to this school doctor, and they said, "Oh, you're just depressed. It's your senior year. You're doing this biogen or grad pre-med. Let's just put you on an SSRI." I'm like, I just intuitively felt like that probably wasn't the solution. So started like digging into overexercise, digging into soy protein, what could be in all this protein that I'm drinking and stuff like that, and discovered soy phytoestrogens, and I was really disappointed that that this medical doctor, at my university couldn't figure out the same research that I was unearthing just like at the library, right? Mm-hmm. And so I discovered functional medicine. I became a sales rep actually for this company, Biotics Research, who only sells healthcare products to licensed healthcare practitioners. And so started, I got to know my network of healthcare practitioners expanded. So this is going back into 2006. Discovered that medicine may not be what I want to do. I was working as an intern with a medical doctor in Denver, and just saw just the repetition, I just like every patient, it was like the same thing. Yeah. So I started to think like, gosh, well, what if I could, I didn't know anything about YouTube back then. But what if I could like say something once and like record it in some way and then, get it out to other people. So I started doing these teleconferences. This is like in 2007.
Wow.
And then I started doing webinars, and then in 2012 I started my first YouTube channel, and that was kind of crappy. And then I started High Intensity Health in 2014. So yeah, it was like iterative, a lot of like mistakes along the way. But really, I mean, how I got to kind of where I am now, not that it is some amazing level necessarily, but it was a lot of mistakes, a lot of challenges, So I don't like have obesity or things like that. But like my brain was totally like, if you would have met me at 15, you'd be like, there's no way that kid could be this person today. Yeah. Right. And so yeah, I don't have this massive weight loss story, but my brain was totally screwed up because like the first time I binge drink, and smoked weed was when I was 9 years old. Oh my God. So like I really had a hard time in school. And so I've totally transformed my brain and body with diet, with nutrition. Right. And so I'm super grateful for that, and good mentors and parents to steer me in the right direction and stuff like that. So yeah,
that's awesome. And then did you have some like just health issues at all? Like I think I heard about some like GI issues or something, or that kind of got you more towards this world specifically.
You know what? It was. So I got into Lauren Cordain's paleo diet research. Boyd Eaton and Lauren Cordain had a bunch of papers in 2005 and 2004 that they published. And so I started to find that when in college, because there was this paleo diet for athletes that had come out, and I was into bike racing. And so there was he co-authored it, Lauren Cordain co-authored that book with a cyclist. I can't remember who his name was, but I discovered that. But yeah, the GI issues, I had no GI issues until I started taking this soy protein. And so it's crazy. And so there was a book that came out called The Whole Soy Story, and that really influenced me. But yeah, it wasn't, it was the primary research from Cordain and Boyd Eaton that got me into the whole paleo diet thing in like 2005. And then I was super fascinated. So I've been kind of grain free, since that period. I mean, we'll periodically have like buckwheat pancakes or something on a weekend, like once a month, but tried to like minimize the anti-nutrients and the lectins and things. And when I was living in Colorado, back then, Lauren Cordain used to go around on the speaking circuit. So got to know him and stuff like that. And there was another gentleman, Robert Crayon, who unfortunately passed away from colon cancer. He kind of ignored the symptoms for a long time, but he was a mentor of mine as well. And so he put on all these seminars. So yeah, that's how I kind of got into this like low anti-nutrient, more ancestral type diet. And then a lot of, layman books came out like 2010, 2011, stuff like that. But yeah, didn't really have GI issues until that soy protein. It was crazy. I remember just being constipated. I'd never experienced constipation. And to experience that was just really problematic. And I could just imagine, people, living like that would just be really tough. And so I think that's where a lot of benefits come from eating more of a animal-based diet, right? The GI issues like almost go away.
So a opposite of what everyone thinks. So yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. And then I saw you post about a DEXA scan too.
Yeah.
So that was really cool that you've been on like keto basically. How long was it? And then what was the whole change?
Yeah. So I started keto in 2015. Really, it's a friend of mine, Alessandro Freddy. I've talked about it a lot. If people have heard this before, they're probably bored of it, but it ties into what we've been talking about. And he had been on the ketogenic diet for quite a while, maybe 2 years, and he found that it really improved his heart rate variability. And so that to me was like this awakening that this diet could change this function of your body's parasympathetic nervous system. And I was really excited about that because for folks that don't really know or understand, have you talked about HRV much on the podcast?
Not really, no.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people, when you say heart rate variability, they think it's related to like your pulse, and it's really not. It's the beat-to-beat variability in consecutive heartbeats, and it's a great indicator of your body's stress response. And so unlike resting heart rate and blood pressure, which generally you want lower, you want more beat-to-beat variability in your heart rate. And it shows that there's more resilience. We were kind of talking about Ted Naiman, about his view on vegetables, right? And this idea that we can be anti-fragile or resilient is a proxy for longevity. And there's really good research showing that individuals that have reduced heart rate variability are at increased risk of sudden cardiac death and all-cause mortality, and even cancer survival, right? If you were to stratify people into their heart rate variability, the people that have really low heart rate variability at the diagnosis of cancer tend to not live as long as people that do. And what's cool is this is malleable. It's not like it's static, right? It's not like your age, right? You can change this. And so I was measuring my HRV back then using this thing called HeartMath, which is a cool tool. It's like a biofeedback tool. And noticed that when I went keto, I was like, wow, I have much more resilience. Like I used to get really irritated in traffic, like especially in LA, Seattle, man, traffic is just, and I realized I wasn't as like triggered, right? And I think it's a really important conversation to have because there's a lot of people that have this perception that when you go on a low carb, high fat diet, have you heard of repeat or people talk about repeat? Yeah. And they say, well, you have to have carbohydrates for your thyroid or your adrenals. And if you're devoid of carbohydrates, it triggers this fight or flight response. You're constantly in a stressed out state. It's really kind of old science. Scientists have actually shown in clinical studies that when you give people sugar and carbohydrates and expose them to a stressful event, there's a disproportionate increase in cortisol and the stress hormones from the glucose. Whereas if you just preload people with fat or protein, the cortisol, norepinephrine, and adrenaline response is not nearly as exaggerated as it is with sugar. So, if you want to be stressed out, like put yourself in a stressful environment and have sugar beforehand or have carbs beforehand. So anyway, getting off topic here, but what I found, and I think this is what people find in general, is when you're eating a more low carb, high fat style diet, high protein, is your body's your resilience is increased. And so that's why I got into the ketogenic diet and things like that. So having tools in your back pocket like HRV testing, it's non-invasive. There's good data behind it. I think it's amazing. So that's how I got into it. But getting back to your question about the testing and stuff. So I run labs twice a year. I've been doing that since 2007. So I have a really good baseline of like where things have been trending, and everything's improved, from my standpoint, on a low carb diet. The only thing now that I've been a little bit more carnivore in the last year is my iron has trended up. So I donate blood twice a year. So that's something that people listening, especially for men like our age, like young, middle-aged men, we tend to accumulate iron. We're not menstruating like women. So donating blood, I think, is just a good practice.
And good in general, but
yeah, good for humanity, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
why
it's
not?
Yeah. I used to be, and I think a lot of people are like this. I don't like venipuncture. I don't like needles, and so giving blood just helps me overcome that fear, But yeah, my wife and I, we both got full body MRIs. Actually, it's a new technology in Vancouver, British Columbia. I heard about it on Peter Attia's podcast, and I was like, wow, this is kind of interesting. Let's just check this out and see, because she's been eating one meal a day for 11 months now since January of 2019. And her body fat percentage, like all these things have improved dramatically, lean muscle mass and everything. And she was eating at some point like 2 to 3 pounds of meat a day in one sitting. And a lot of people were like, it's going to rot your kidneys, it's going to rot your liver, all the perceptions about meat. And there's arguably no better test to see, kidney function, liver function, and histology than an MRI, especially this technology. It's a diffusion weight imaged full body MRI. And so, obviously, we went there, no issues with liver, kidney, no buildup of iron, virtually zero visceral fat on my wife. Me, I had a very small amount. So, yeah, I mean, this is what, Sean Baker and other people have talked about. It's like, how can eating an animal-based diet or a ketogenic diet or whatever, the diet that we're kind of talking, the sapien diet that you talk about, right?
Yeah.
How can that be so problematic for people if it pivots your body into a metabolic state where you're preserving lean mass, you don't have buildup of visceral fat, you feel good, you're energetic, you're having physical PRs, like how could that really be rotting your colon or, these myths? So that was pretty interesting. And then we got a DEXA recently after that and both have high bone mineral density. That was the other thing. My wife, the reason why we got the MRIs actually is she's had 2 first-degree relatives with cancer. Mm-hmm. Her mother is struggling with cancer now for the second time, and she lost her sister to a glioblastoma. So we wanted to make sure to see if there's anything, just get ahead of it basically, because there's not a lot of good cancer screening tests, that are blood work. I mean, there's not a lot out there, right? And so this was a good way to see. So the MRI could see anything that's greater than 0.5 centimeter. So anyhow, long story short, nothing growing and not. But so I think testing is really good for people to get baselines, because as people's diet improves and their health improves, you kind of lose a reference point unless you see old pictures of yourself, right? And so having blood work, I think, is super good.
I love that. Yeah, I was a little bit opposed to all this testing because I'm like, let's just be natural and do it and make it intuitive. Yeah. But some things, it's like we have modern technology, and if you're interested, why not? And I think it's good. And I love that you did all these tests, and it's been over 4 years. So it kind of debunks, I know it's N of 2, but you almost debunk every little thing. It's, you're going to stress out your body, your kidney, all that stuff. It's like, well, I have hard data. Like this, you can't get much better than this.
So yeah, I think people can get carried away with testing, right? Where they spend a bunch of money on testing. And a mentor, Gerard Guillory, who I internship with that I was telling you about, one thing that he told me that I think is really important is don't test something if it's not going to change your treatment, right? So a lot of people will get, let's just say a microbiome test or a gene test or whatever, and they don't really, it's like if it's not going to change anything, it's not really good to test because it can actually freak people out. And I made this mistake because I was at the kind of the height of my vegetable consumption, and I'm not necessarily always anti-vegetable per se. We grow vegetables and all that. So the first year that we were growing vegetables here, we had just a ton of kale, a ton of Swiss chard. It's like every day we're just like the bigger the salad, the better, right?
Yeah.
Because I did a lot of this training from the Institute for Functional Medicine, and there's a big emphasis on fiber. There's a big emphasis on phytonutrients, and thanks to Paul Saladino, I'm really kind of questioning some of that. Not that I think phytonutrients are necessarily bad, but I definitely did not think that you could overdo fiber or vegetables. But anyway, so we were having these monster salads and stuff like that. And I used to get all this GI pain, like just I feel like this lump of like all the vegetables. Imagine like if you make a smoothie and you just kind of, it's like the pulp, right? And so I was just like, gosh, I'm going to get every cancer blood test I could, because it was always in the same spot. And I thought maybe I had like this tumor, because back then my lifestyle was pretty crappy. I was going to Chicago every other week. I was like on the road a lot, managing different territories for a supplement brand. And so I was testing all these different cancer biomarkers, CA125, CA16, and one of them, alpha fetoprotein, which is linked with metastatic liver cancer, also testicular cancer. I was like, I'll just test this thing. But we don't have any good baselines for what like your alpha fetoprotein should be or what mine should be cancer-free. It's mostly in individuals that have hepatitis or liver cancer or testicular cancer. So mine came back like 10 times higher than the reference range. And then it caused this whole rabbit hole of me trying to figure out what the hell was going on. And that was part of the impetus, again, to get the MRI. But I think it's, again, the point that I'm trying to make here is sometimes you can overdo the lab testing. And if you don't have a really good indication of, if I'm going to test this biomarker and know what I'm going to do, if that is out of line, then it's probably not good to test. But here's what's really cool. There's this new epigenetic biological age technology called the GRIM age test. And it's a very non-invasive blood spot. I just sent it in last Wednesday. It's $275, but it can test your biological age against and pair that against your chronological age. So I'm 37. It'll be interesting to see if my lifestyle, my stress management, my sleep, my diet, my exercise, like how that is affecting, my epigenome and my age. And so if you've talked about epigenetics before, I'm sure.
Yeah, well, I had Dr. Anthony J. We had talked
nice.
some good stuff about that. Yeah, but keep going. Yeah.
So super important. And we're both, you're filming this on an iPhone. A lot of people have iPhones now or computers. We know that the software doesn't really change unless we get a new phone. But there's constant, the hardware doesn't change, but there's constant software updates. And so your epigenome is kind of like the software that's running your genomic hardware. And so, it'll be interesting. So we can make inferences from the epigenome. It's more malleable. It's more inducible by lifestyle change. And so I think that will be pretty cool. I'm curious to see like what people, going on a carnivorous diet and doing intermittent fasting and exercise, how their epigenome is looking from an age standpoint. And then I might do a test and go vegan and just see for like 90 days. I don't know, see how things go. But yeah, blood markers are important.
I think I'm getting more into this.
Nice.
I think that the testing is a good idea, and the epigenetics is super interesting because we have the same genes as people who are just a few generations ago. But I just heard on Joe Rogan, I think they're talking about the Civil War soldiers were like 5'7", 5'6". They're like 120 pounds. It's like it's not like we have wildly different genes, but our diets have improved a lot since then, right? They didn't have adequate nutrition and they probably couldn't reach their full potential, but still it's not like we have wildly different genes. It's just the gene expression has changed.
Right. It's super fascinating. Yeah. I mean, and I think it's changed, like, the height has increased like you're talking about, but there's a lot of other diseases that have increased, right, in a negative way. And if you look at, you're mid-30s?
36, yeah.
Okay, yeah. So I remember in biology class, I can't believe I remember this, I think it was 4th or 5th grade, where we're talking about diabetes. And it was really underscored. Type 1 diabetes is autoimmune. You get it as a child. Type 2 diabetes is called adult onset diabetes. I remember it was like indelibly inked in my head. But now we have kids with type 2 diabetes, right? Yeah. And so we're seeing this, you talked about Anthony J. talking about endocrine disrupting chemicals and bisphenol A and phthalates, and flame retardants are a big one in all of our furniture and clothing, and unfortunately water and food now. But those not only affect our genes and our epigenome, but they have transgenerational effects. So what, our grandparents did, their diet, their lifestyle, their chemical exposure, that's influencing us now. And we see so many people our age or even younger with low testosterone, right? With chronic inflammatory diseases and all that. And so I think at one level, it's scary. On the other hand, we can change our epigenome. We can change the gene signaling through good nutrition. And I think that's where, these dietary strategies that you talk a lot about and in your film are going to shine, because, the messages that you're sending to your genes and epigenome, eating processed food and like a junky vegan diet is not going to be favorable long term. And that's why we see, if you look at the infertility rates, people our age, it's so many people are going to fertility specialists and doctors and all that. But yeah, so it's scary. Speaking of like Civil War time and all that, so Ansel Keys did the Minnesota starvation experiment, right? So I recently bought, there's 2 books out on the topic. You can probably link them in the show notes that are super fascinating, but they talked about the rations in World War I and World War II, because that's how Ansel Keys kind of got his foot in the nutrition game, was helping to reformulate.
Rations.
Yeah. And it was so it was a lot of, so they had cigarettes, right? So some alcohol, but it was a lot. I think it was like at least 20 ounces of some sort of meat. And so it was like meatloaf or corned beef. There was grains in there as well, but it was kind of funny to kind of look at the war rations, for the soldiers. They weren't prioritizing corn necessarily, right? It was like they're trying to give these guys meat, and it was pretty interesting to see his formulation and stuff like that he came about with. So,
yeah. No, that's cool. And also you talk about vegan diet, and all this stuff kind of reminded me of the Game Changers. And because I made that debunk film, and everyone's debunking it, it's great. Yeah. But they mentioned in the film, there's not one diet for longevity and one diet for athletics and one diet. They're trying to claim that the vegan diet had all of these, which is so funny because from actual science, we see that there kind of is one diet for all these that helps. It's like you're talking about Sean Baker and these. Yeah. It's like why is everyone doing so well if it's so bad? And to just have like the sapien diet, like I don't think that there's any one way to do things, right? It's like not just carnivore, not keto, but the sapien framework kind of is the one size fits all diet if you find out what works for you in that framework. That's actually we're seeing by science and seeing by your MRIs and DEXAs, and it's not just you, that we're seeing this from all sides, that people are improving.
Totally. No, it's key. And I think, Chris Kresser talked about this, and I haven't watched too many of the reviews, and I know you just posted that video like Friday or something like that. But, if you take someone who's eating just a bunch of junk food, so in that film, there's a lot of athletes that are featured. And we know most, especially athletes in their 20s, these NFL football players and stuff, a lot of them eat fast food and junk, right? And so if you were to put them on like get off kind of the processed food and just give them like more vegetables and things, they probably would feel better for a little while. And Chris talked about kind of the vegan honeymoon. And so there's some of that, but long term, I mean, with all due respect to the football players, the Tennessee Titans, I mean, they haven't made the playoffs recently. They're I think 4-6 or 6-4 this year. They don't have a winning record, right? So it's just interesting. And look, my wife and I have done the plant-based vegan thing. Like we went to Bali, Indonesia a few years ago. Like we were talking about in Peru, like, all the woken, Instagram people are going to these tourist destinations and driving non-native food, restaurants and stuff. And so we were really influenced by that and did a lot of yoga and this and that. And both came back and everyone was like, wow, Mike, you guys look skinny. You look smaller. Like everyone said that to us. We lost a lot of like strength and size. And not that we're trying to be bodybuilders, but you're like losing muscle mass. Muscle is an organ of longevity. I mean, if you look at grip strength, you look at what people like their gaits and their physical gait like that. These things are proxies for how you're going to age. And so you don't want to be, if a diet is causing you to lose muscle, that's not a good thing long term. But yeah, so that movie, I mean, there was a lot of speculation and thing. One thing that I thought was pretty interesting. I mean, they're talking a lot about the cardiovascular system and saying that basically, once you go on this plant-based diet, you're going to sprout all these new blood vessels, and meat products are really, inflammatory to the vascular system. And they didn't once talk about insulin or glucose or anything like that. So it's having animal fats is not necessarily more unhealthy than plant-based. You could have a bunch of canola oil and soybean oil and really cause endothelial dysfunction. They never really qualified. So yeah, but they're going to convince a lot of people to go vegan. I mean, that movie for sure. In fact, where was I the other day? Gosh, my wife and I were getting coffee and we overheard someone talk about how they're going to order, I can't remember, was it coffee or we're getting dinner? I can't remember where we were on her birthday, but we overheard two different people talk about the movie Game Changers and how it's causing them to go vegan now. So it's just amazing how we got to have good films like your film, coming out to help people realize that some of that is a little bit more of sensational marketing and not so much science.
Well, I want to show both sides. I mean, Food Lies, the whole goal of it is to just demystify this nutrition thing and to show that you can go different routes and get the same results. And that, yes, everyone's different. You can have a different diet, but it's like you can go this high fat route and be healthy. You could go on a, more low fat pescatarian style diet and be healthy if you cut out all the processed foods. So it's not going to be some kind of propaganda film. Like, it's not going to be a keto carnivore film. Everyone thinks that. Everyone thinks I'm carnivore. It's weird. I'm like, I've never said the word carnivore. I've never connected myself with carnivore or keto, actually.
I would have thought that though, for sure. Yeah.
That's what everyone thinks. But I'm like, well, because I post about stuff, but I didn't say, I'm just saying meat is good. I'm not saying only eat meat. And I kind of just saying that if you eat within this sapient framework, you can pick which version of it works for you, and that there's different versions. So yeah, I definitely want to get that out to the world. And
I think that's super important, not to interrupt you, but I think that this is where it's kind of like pick your path, find out what works for you under a framework, and don't be, I think when it comes to nutrition, there's a lot of biases, number one. And number two, there's a lot of like subtle food addictions that cause people to not pivot their diet. And they'll say things like, I just have to have my cake, or I couldn't imagine life without bread. And so I think we need to kind of, disentangle like food addictions and what you're eating for some sort of emotional connection to what's really good for human nutrition and what's best for you. But yeah, some sort of hybrid model I think is great. And, because a lot of people, they go carnivore and they think they can never have an avocado again. And it's like, look, I mean, your body might metabolize, and some people maybe have an avocado allergy. They're probably few and far between, but I think there is some benefits to a little diversity in your diet. You don't need to have 26 different vegetables every day, right? But I think there is something, and like you said, you have fermented vegetables. So there's something like when you travel to different cultures and you see healthy people, they are having like little ferments. They're having a little kimchi, sauerkraut, things that are locally grown. But in our world, we deviate from that. Even the health people, they're like, oh, I'm gonna have a blueberry smoothie, frozen blueberry smoothie on New Year's Day. You're like, well, where are you gonna find blueberries in North America during that time of year? They're shipped from Chile and using. So I think it's important to hear this from both sides, and learn a little bit and kind of pick your path and see what works for you.
Yeah, I love that. So you're big on fasting and all this stuff. So I'm really interested in like time restricted feeding and stuff. I've never gotten really into these extended fasts, but let's just kind of break down fasting and just how that even works and what the different types are. Sure.
Yeah, well, I mean, it lends itself well to, this kind of eating. The more fat adapted you become, fasting becomes easier. But, to make a long story short, there's a lot of people that kind of talk about calorie restriction. There's some good data in animals, in humans as well. Restricting your calories about 20% or so improves longevity and causes an increase in different genes related to stress response and longevity. But that can be kind of hard to do, right? It's just like on a volitional effort. So I think it's easier for people to just say, I'm only going to eat during certain time periods. And so that's called time restricted feeding. It's a subset of intermittent fasting. So underneath the intermittent fasting umbrella, I mean, there's alternate day fasting, which was one of the first human clinical studies that came out at Johns Hopkins University in 2004, was individuals that were overweight that also had asthma. And so the first intermittent fasting intervention was actually looking at more inflammatory markers, which I think is important to kind of circle back to because a lot of people have inflammation. And so just, going without food, not restricting calories, but just eating every other day, dramatically decreased a bunch of inflammatory cytokines that were linked with inflammation and asthma in these overweight people. They also had an improvement in their body composition and lean mass and fat loss and all that. And so since then, there's been a bunch of intermittent fasting clinical studies that have come out. But one thing that's kind of interesting, in the last 6 or 7 years, we've learned much more about the circadian clock system that regulates human physiology. And this is why women menstruate on a predictable manner. This is why men wake up with an erection. Everything oscillates, with the rise and fall of the sun. And so part of, human evolution or natural selection, however you want to view it, is, we would live in harmony with our environment. And so we know that along those lines, our body's ability to metabolize and break down food, like gastric secretion and bile acid flow and HCl. Like right now, as we record this about 11 a.m., 10:45 to be specific, our gastrointestinal juices are going to be starting to activate. Like this is the body, like midday, leptin is at its lowest point. So we're really primed to eat. And so I think that's where this time restricted feeding comes in. It's really good to bake in some element of intermittent fasting within this time restricted feeding framework so that you're consuming food when your body from a circadian rhythm standpoint is primed to break it down and utilize it. We're also more insulin sensitive in the earlier part of the day, and we become more insulin resistant as the day goes on. So what a lot of people are doing when it comes to intermittent fasting is they're just skipping breakfast, skipping lunch. Okay, no problems necessarily with that, but they're having their biggest meal later in the day. And if you live in Chile or Argentina or South America, that's just like how the culture is. There's nothing you can do about it, which is fine. But I think if you have a little bit more flexibility in your social, family framework to eat earlier in the day and stop eating earlier. Because again, and studies have actually shown this in time restricted feeding versus all day feeding studies have actually shown that eating the same amount of calories just kind of packed in between a window of 8 a.m. to 2 p.m., which is called early time restricted feeding, improved longevity, affected various proxies for longevity, including autophagy, upregulated autophagy, improved blood sugar regulation, all that. So that's what I personally do. But on Mondays, I just don't eat any food at all. So I just have a little bit of coffee. We had an espresso, which is my second espresso, but whatever. I'm not worried about coffee affecting my fast. But yeah, so that's kind of the idea. But I think it's just good that anyone, whatever diet you're on, is put some hard stops on when you're going to stop eating. And this is kind of my qualm with this so-called low-calorie diet approach is there's no real element of circadian biology in the calories in, calories out model. It's just like, oh, well, if you expend whatever, an extra 700 calories a day through exercise and your body weight is this is how much food you should eat. And I think it really kind of misses the point, and it's kind of unscientific. That whole model was kind of constructed before we knew about circadian biology. And I think it's interesting, but why should people consider this? It causes us to, when you go without food, it causes glucose to drop. It causes insulin to drop. And that really causes then different hormones like glucagon to increase, which help our body liberate more stored body fat, from adipocytes and utilize that directly as fuel or convert that in the liver to ketones. So it's a natural way to get yourself into ketosis, which has benefits from, enhancing brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is good for sprouting new neurons, and it's good for brain health. And there is some really good data just showing like reductions in glycemic variability. So having low glucose and thriving on ketones has some benefits for reducing glycation and free radical stressors and inducing autophagy and really relying upon mitochondrial metabolism and so forth instead of like fermenting sugar and so on. So that's why I do it. And the reason why I don't have food on Mondays is I just think there's something to be said about a little bowel rest. I have no randomized human clinical studies to show this, but I find that I do recording, I do a lot of reading, do a lot of research on Mondays, and it's usually a busier day of the week. And so it's just easier to not have that burden of like meal prep. What am I going to eat? When am I going to eat? Do I have food? It's just like take that all off the table. And part of fasting, I think, is it's a stoic practice. It's like discipline. So it's not, for me, it's not really about calories. It's like, do I have the wherewithal, the willpower to do what most people don't want to do? And that's actually the book about Ansel Keys is fasting is so much more mental than, and these guys, I think they started out at 36 men in this Minnesota starvation experiment and dropped down to like 20 something. A lot of people just gave up because they were like, I can't do this. And so that's why I do things like exercise. It's tough. Like exercise is tough. I have a cold plunge out there, cold showers. Like I like to bake that into my life. And I find that I just feel happier when I do that stuff. And because life is so easy, we can get very complacent. You don't even have to leave your house. You can order everything off the internet or an app. And so I think weaving in some of these stoic practices into your life can help you mentally. So
I love that. There's so many things there. I love this, that making something hard. If everything's so easy, I feel like I even try to do this with work. Like when I used to work real jobs, you're just there and you have to work, right? And you're there and it's hard and you have to do every hour you're got to produce something really. And so I don't want to get too soft where I can just have my own schedule and just do a whole day without getting things done. It's like you're not going to be as disciplined if you get into these modes.
Like traveling all the time or screwing around.
Yeah, something like that. Or just like I need to produce. It's like it's so easy to be like, I don't have a boss, so I'm not going to produce in this hour. But then if you get lazy, then it just keeps going. So it's the same thing with life. If you're like, I'm not going to make something hard for me, like, yeah, cold plunge is something you don't want to do, but you feel amazing after.
Totally.
And another thing is really important that you talked about not restricting calories. A lot of people think fasting is about restricting calories. And yes, it can help people restrict calories, especially if the time restricted feeding can help people restrict calories. But guys like you and me, we're just we're not trying to lose weight. We're trying to maintain weight or maybe even build some muscle. So just because you're not eating on Monday doesn't mean you're calorie restricting over the week.
Right.
You're still eating the same amount of calories. You're just eating them at different times and you're letting your body rest in between.
Yeah. And I think there is something to be said about having a little bit of variability, because what a lot of people do, and I see this with clients, I saw this all the time, is there's especially women for whatever reason, very anal retentive, very like by the book. So they'll have 1,737 calories a day or whatever, right? I don't know, you name the number, but it's like, so they're eating all the time. So the body becomes really, there's no variability. I think that is problematic. So I find that it's easier to maintain a lean body composition. It's easier to build muscle when there is some inherent instability in there. And so I don't want to say volatility, but it's not as predictable. And so I find that, here's why I think this. And I could be totally wrong about this. If you look at the adaptations that occur through exercise, so improved, capillary flow, mitochondrial biogenesis, like all these different things, even autophagy is involved in the post-exercise recovery process. A lot of the adaptations that are built in through exercise, we also see a lot of those same adaptations through food and fasting and so forth. Improved ability to replenish glycogen upon refeeding, insulin sensitivity, all those things. So I kind of view fasting as a form, at least the adaptations that are incurred through fasting, as a form of exercise in a sense. So I think I would never do the same exercise every single day. Right? It's going to change. Like the volume's going to change, the rest period's going to change. And I think if we can do that with our feeding is similar too. Like now my body, is starting to get more accustomed to no food on Mondays, and it's a lot easier mentally and stuff like that. But I feel like having that variability, whereas I was in a surplus around Thanksgiving, and kind of took the brakes off, the quantity and kind of stacked a little bit more because food was around, still ate clean, but then having a fast kind of helps. And
Well, I love that mental side because so much of food is mental, right? And I'm trying to write a book right now about it's really about satiety is the central theme of the book. But it's about there's two reasons why people eat. It's either they need calories or just nutrition needs, or it's mental, right? It's like if some people just eat even though they're not even hungry, right? And it's so huge. And fasting, you have to deal with that.
Right. Well, I think I have a video about this. It's funny that you bring that up because a lot of people don't recognize that. That's why I think fasting is so powerful, because it causes you to deal with, okay, I'm bored. I would normally satisfy this boredom or self-medicate with food or with alcohol. Right. And so when you don't have food, you have to work through those emotions and think about, why do I want to go to the cupboard or to the refrigerator right now? Is it really biological hunger, or is it some sort of unmet emotional need that I'm trying to quell? And so I think that is part of the power of this is you become so much stronger, more resilient, and you become more in tune with your emotions. And so I think it's so powerful, if nothing else. But there's been studies on fasting. It's very safe. A lot of people say, you have to have glucose because of brain and everything like that. And the brain does demand a lot of energy. And that's why our liver makes ketones as a way to, a backdoor way to get that energy. So it's very safe. Even for a lot of people on diabetic medication, there was a recent meta-analysis that came out that studied intermittent fasting clinical trials, and this was an endocrinology journal. It just was published, I think, on Sunday, talking about this. It's very safe, even for people that are have their diabetes medicated. Now, if they're on insulin, they might need to take more caution because there could be more hypoglycemic instances in that situation. But it's very safe. Cultures have been doing it forever, right? If you look at animals fast, I mean, just, foods, this idea that food is available 24/7 is really a modern construct.
It's insane.
So there's a lot of benefits to it,
Well, so people I do get these comments, just being on social media in nature, people are always trying to attack you, or they're like, oh, you're doing this fight or flight, or you're causing stress to your body. It's like, there's cortisol, from fasting. It's like, well, there's also cortisol from eating every couple of hours.
Totally. Dude, if you eat, cortisol is raised no matter what. I mean, if you have a vegan, plant-based, high-carb meal, you're going to raise cortisol in the post-meal window. That's the thing that is funny. There's this, his name is Dr. Woods. He was at University of Washington, actually. When you eat, you're disrupting homeostasis. When you disrupt homeostasis, counter-regulatory hormones, cortisol, adrenaline, noradrenaline increase, because we think that eating is this benign event because it kind of feels good. You're like, oh, I just had this big meal. You're totally throwing a monkey wrench in your body's homeostatic. You're increasing glucose, right? That's why insulin is increasing. And so it's not like eating is a free ride, And so the people that say these things, they're really kind of piggybacking off. Well, first of all, it's coming from a bias standpoint. And I admit I'm biased pro fasting, right? But fasting is not, after day 3, day 4, at least for me, that's when I feel the stress hormones. Day 1, it's amazing. I'll sleep really good tonight. And then if I were to fast all week, then it would be a little bit more on edge on Friday, because that's when the cortisol and the noradrenaline really start surging to increase more glucose from anew. But the first few days, there's not all this stress. And so anyway, it's interesting. I mean, if you look at it's called the postprandial metabolic response. And so even if you eat a vegan meal or if you eat a high carb meal, like these people are saying, you're still increasing these hormones that they're talking about. So yeah, it's interesting.
So we talked about some of the different versions, and even I just do like a 16-8 thing normally, right? And I've never really gotten into multi-day fasting. I mean, I've done a couple 24-hour fasts, and I felt fine. And a lot of it is mental too. It's like you're not hungry. You actually aren't really hungry. It's like unless your body expects food. I mean, maybe if the first time you do a fast, it's hard.
Because there is a lot of this cephalic phase digestion built in. A lot of us don't realize, like we just fed the pigs earlier, you know, you might have noticed they're starting to salivate because they know in the morning they're going to eat, right? And we're big Pavlovian animals, right? If you eat breakfast every day, or if you have a bulletproof coffee at 10 a.m. every day, your body is going to anticipate that. And it goes back to kind of that Dr. Woods that I was telling you about. Your body anticipates this stuff so it can minimize the homeostatic disruption. So it can minimize the effect. And so you're going to get a little pre-meal insulin release if you normally eat at 10 a.m. or if you normally eat at 2. And then all of a sudden, when you don't have that food, your body's, that anticipatory response is still happening. And so you might feel more agitated, right? You might feel, so yeah, you're working through this. And it's interesting. So if you look at the proposed nutritional management of type 2 diabetes, it's like small, frequent meals, right? So type 2 diabetes is characterized by insulin resistance, hyperinsulinemia. The medical management for post-meal hypoglycemia, so reactive hypoglycemia, is the same thing. Small meals every 2 to 3 hours. You're like, well, that's not really like the etiology or the reason why you get those diseases are totally different. And so a lot of people have this, this post-meal hypoglycemia or reactive hypoglycemia from anticipation of food. So they're always anticipating food, or they're used to eating at this time. And then when they don't, their blood sugar crashes. You're like, well, why is that? Because there was a little pre-meal insulin release. And so that's what you have to work through with fasting. And you're better able to overcome that, because you're not having that trigger, And so even when you first start time restricted feeding or 16-8 like you do, you're going to work through that. And people are going to be like, the first couple of days, you're like, oh man, this feels tough. Like I feel jittery or I feel off. It's partly because of this cephalic pre-phase insulin release. And you're going to over time, it's going to, it's like you got to crawl before you run and walk and all that. So that sort of thing happens. So.
So what's the minimum effective dose of fasting though? Like a 16-8, that could be good for people for weight loss. And are we actually getting autophagy, or do we need this like 24 to 48 hour?
It's a great question. It depends on your degree of physical activity. So I'll just share with you a few studies that I have talked about a lot on YouTube. But one study was a 36-hour fast, and they had two arms of the study. They had one group that was very physically fit, very physically active, regular exercisers. They had another group that was sedentary and overweight. And they looked at, let me just back up. The reason why these studies and autophagy is kind of this elusive thing is it's occurring intracellularly. So it's not like you can measure one blood biomarker and test autophagy. It's going on within the cell. And so you have to do biopsies or transcriptome. You have to do more. There's not a commercially available test to test it, right? But to make a long story short, the individuals that were physically fit got at 36 hours of fasting, their level of autophagy within, I think it was a white blood cell, increased like 200%, right? Whereas the individuals that were sedentary, they didn't see a statistically significant change in autophagy after 36 hours of fasting. So it's not that it's as clear cut. Like if everyone does this will happen to autophagy. It really depends on your degree of physical fitness. And partly I think that is because of the adaptations that occur with fitness are actually autophagy mediated. And there's probably more tight blood sugar regulation and ability to make that metabolic switch away from glucose metabolism towards fatty acid metabolism. So, but to answer your question, one of the recent human clinical studies, we don't have a lot of good data in humans, but they did show that it was doing a 16-8, but with an element of time restricted feeding, cutting off the feeding window at 2 p.m. did show an increase in autophagy compared to people that had a 12-hour window. So the minimum effective dose, I think for most people, bare minimum, like if you want to just do nothing else, just at least fast for 12 hours a day, at least. Yeah. Like that's just like the bare minimum. Definitely. Now that's like learning how to crawl. Like if you've been snacking all the time, eating pizza and doing all this stuff, just start with 12 hours, then go a 14-hour fast and then work your way up to 16-8. Then maybe bake in one 24-hour fast a month, Do you need to do I think people overdo the fast. I've met this one, gosh, bless his heart. This kid was 19 years old. He was like, I'm on a 7-day fast. And he was already super skinny. Oh, wow. I'm thinking, he's like, I'm so worried about autophagy. I'm like, dude, fasting and autophagy dysfunction is really kind of we need to think about age. Like autophagy declines as you age. At 19, I'm not concerned about dysfunctional autophagy. Like I want you to like build some muscle and some strength and this and that. If you were 68 years old, I might say, okay, a 7-day fast once a quarter, that might be worth considering, So I think we need to understand that autophagy declines with age. Autophagy dysfunction is linked with many different diseases, right? And so, but it's not something that young people really should be concerned about. I think just doing a 16-8, every day and maybe a 48-hour fast once a year, something that is probably sufficient, for most young people. But also consider your health history, right? Do you have a history of insulin resistance, diabetes, autoimmunity, eating every 2 to 3 hours, stuff like that, burning the candle at both ends? Then you might need to ramp up some of the longer duration fasts. But outside of 72 hours, we don't have a lot of good data on when autophagy increases or not. In fact, one intermittent fasting study did look at autophagy biomarkers after 72 hours, and it was only increased like 34% or something, autophagy. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't other benefits, but so I think I would rather people exercise more regularly than do more regular long fasts. That's just my personal opinion.
I like that. And what about even just making that window smaller, like 18-hour, 20-hour, not eating? And, I was listening to David Sinclair, and you've probably heard a lot about him. Yeah. And he talking about these rodent studies that they had the best biomarkers and all this if they were eating, it was like 23 hours, something about like only eating once every 24 hours. So there's that. But then I feel like I've done OMAD a little bit. I'm doing OMAD right now just for a couple of days. But is that ideal? Because I feel like it might be a little hard to eat that many calories at once. I know it sounds like your wife does it and it's gotten used to it, but I just did it last night. I only had one meal at 5 and I just ate tons and tons of meat. The Brazilian barbecue place.
Nice.
Going crazy over there. It was great. But I also, this is kind of running into my little theory that humans have the size of their stomach is about half a day's calories. I think, right? It's like but you can get used to many things, but I have this theory that 2 times a day is optimum, 2 meals a day is optimum. I was talking about this with Ted Naiman. We got a chance to meet up in the city and just talk forever. It's nice. Like just like a nutrition geek. Yeah. Heaven right there. Well, that's what we're doing now too. So I just think that 2 meals a day is ideal. 1, I think, is a little too much at once. 3, I don't think you need to eat that many times. And if you just eat until you're actually full, that's about half a day's calories, right? So that's why twice a day works. If you're trying to do it at once, it feels like it's too much. You're expanding your stomach too much. And I think 3 meals a day, you'd have to eat less than you were actually full, right? I don't like that people trying to go around all day restricting, right? It's like, I don't want to, I got to eat until I'm 80% full.
Yeah, you're like, how do you even, what is 80% full?
Yeah, Hari Hachibu, Japanese term. But I don't know. So what do you think about 1 meal compared to 2 meals compared to 3 meals?
Oh man, such a great question. Well, I think it depends on age and if it's a male, female, like what are your goals? My wife she just turned 44 actually on Saturday. And so she's had a lot of success doing 1 meal a day. And interestingly, there was actually this protein pulse feeding study conducted in young women versus older women. And it turned out that older women eating just 1 meal a day, and by older, the inclusion criteria in this study was over the age of 60, they actually preserved more lean mass and had greater indices of muscle protein synthesis just eating 1 meal a day. So it may be that younger people might need pulses, like you said, 2 or maybe 3, depending upon the athlete. But as you get older, for whatever reason, the assimilation tended to be better at just 1 meal a day. My wife has noticed a lot of improvements just going OMAD, and productivity, mental clarity, energy, ability to, just burn body fat, stay lean effortlessly. So I think it kind of depends, but I think it kind of goes back to what you were saying is like, try these different things on and see what works for you. Like when it comes to, okay, do you need to be strict carnivore, or can you have an avocado? Can you have fermented veggies, whatever? I think that's where the feeding fasting patterns come in. But I do think the more meals you have, the more preoccupied you will be with food. And studies have teased this out, whether you have your calories over 6 or 7 meals versus 2 or 3 meals, the folks that eat 6 or 7 times a day are just constantly thinking about food. And so like we're talking about as entrepreneurs, business owners, parents, like, if you have maybe your CPU, your mental processor, like you don't want it to be 20% just spinning, thinking about food all the time. Like if you could free that up, you can focus on bigger things that are going to contribute to the world. So that's what I think. And it really depends too on the types of protein you have. And so fast digested protein, maybe eggs, whey protein, cheese, and then slower digesting proteins I saved this, but my battery just died. But we have a backup there. Okay. So yeah, you have fast digesting proteins versus slow digesting proteins. So if you're just going to do 1 or 2 meals, I think being mindful of the speed of digestion, if you're an athlete, if you care about that, on muscle protein synthesis. So yeah, I think, but there's a lot of fear about mTOR, about protein. People are scared that protein is going to stimulate mTOR and pro-growth and cause cancer. And I think we need to focus on mTOR overexpression, and so people shouldn't be scared about having protein twice a day. It's not that big of a deal. Bodybuilders have been having high protein diets and high carb diets for a very long time. That the incidence of cancer is not disproportionately higher in bodybuilders. They have other diseases and things like that. But so I think the meal frequency definitely needs to be part of the equation that people should think about, and just customize it based upon what helps you feel your best.
Yeah. Well, so what about sleep?
Oh man, sleep's so important. Yeah, man. Well, you noticed, you were sleeping on a crappy futon last night, and you were saying that you don't feel that good today. I found, and this is where fasting comes in, and time restricted feeding, like the earlier that you eat, the better, at least I found in many clients that I work with, the better their sleep is. So I think that's an element that we need to, making that connection between when you eat and how it impacts other bodily functions like sleep is super cool. I think it's really important. I went on a 10-day, I was out there for 8 days. The other group I was with was out there for 10 days. We went on a backcountry mule deer hunt. So we were in bed, like in our campsite. This was in Idaho, middle of Idaho. And some of the best sleep I ever got in my life. And so we were up at 5:30. We're in bed by 8. Amazing sleep. We were eating early. So sleep's huge. You look at people that get crappy sleep, epidemiological, shift workers, people that have to work, in various environments, like in the hospital type settings, the incidence of different diseases is much higher, right? Because their circadian rhythm is perturbed and all that. So sleep's so important. We got to prioritize that. And that's where this chrononutrition, or when you eat, that can impact your sleep in the reverse direction, right? So it's important to get sleep for good metabolic health, but you can improve your sleep by timing your nutrition properly, which is kind of cool.
Is 4 hours before you sleep like a good cutoff to eat?
I think it depends for everyone, but I'd say at least 3 hours should be kind of the minimum, like you said, minimum effective dose. I think 3 hours is probably sufficient for sure. Yeah.
I notice I just naturally eat 4 hours after I wake up, and I stop eating 4 hours before I go to sleep. So that's my 8-hour window is just kind of there. But I'd like, in an ideal world, I like the circadian rhythm of doing it earlier in the day.
Yeah. But sometimes it's hard, right? If you get in a workflow, you don't want to interrupt that with food, So I think it totally depends. Yeah, that's good though. But like you said, find out what works for you. And here's what's unique is like this may work for you now. It may change over time, you might find. And so I think having that idea or open-mindedness to know that like my body, what works now may not work in 10 years, right? You got to be always adapting.
Yeah, you kind of become less carb tolerant as you age too. Right?
Yeah.
It's weird how the body works, that things as you age, you need more protein.
Right. Right. A lot of people.
Things like that.
Totally. That's huge, man.
So, here's a question I had about fasting. When you're fasting, you're burning fat, but do you get, like, say, some fat-soluble vitamins, A, D, E, K, like, you need fat with them. So if you took a vitamin when you're fasting, would your body fat, like burning, actually give you that?
That's a good question. I would think so. I don't have any data to go off. But when I fast outside of electrolytes, I don't take anything. I just, but yeah, maybe it would liberate some of those different things like you're speaking of. But like if you're fasting and, should you take your vitamin D? Should you take your CoQ10? Should you take your vitamin K? Those are days that I just don't take it. But, now there's a lot of emulsified or microemulsified or micelle delivery systems for these fat soluble vitamins. So maybe they would still get absorbed too. But, yeah, I mean, it's kind of interesting, I think, but you bring up a really good point, is when we're fasting, the overall flux of our adipocytes, our fat cells, is increased, and there's a lot of data showing that as you get more metabolically unhealthy, that flux declines. And so, for example, if you were to radioisotope like palmitic acid from some food we ate and watch it go through our liver and lymphatic system and into our fat cells, it's going to like recirculate. Like 50% of the fat that our fat cells release goes right back in. And that recycling diminishes as we get more metabolically unhealthy. So there's something to be said about just increasing the flux. It keeps the fat cells happy. Who knows how, why, what. But I think that's part of the reason why, doing fasted cardio, having caffeine, doing intermittent fasting, all these things, you increase that flux, which calorie balance might be the same, but metabolically, it's changing the behavior of the fat cells, and there's some benefit to that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I gotta get to the airport soon, but
yeah, man.
I was just thinking about this animal models you talked about, 20% calorie reduction over they have longer life, but for one, that's only rodents, but I don't think people should be calorie restricting over a long period of time. I feel like there's a big difference between just fasting or just getting the adequate calories. I guess I talked about this Mark Sisson. He wants to find the least he can eat and still be great. Does that make sense? So if you overeat and then over-exercise, I feel like you're taxing your body more. So what if there is like this perfect amount of food that you eat where it's not too much? Do you think there's a balance there? And it's just over the course of your life, you're going to eat fewer calories, but you're never in a deficit. Exactly.
Right. That makes sense. I like that approach. I don't know I like the idea of having more variability. So I like the idea of having like and here's why I fast one day a week and just don't eat on Mondays, is it puts you at about 15% roughly, without doing anything else, 15% calorie deficit over the course of the long term. Mm-hmm. So I think, day by day, that's hard to manage, but I think if you're just maybe fast one day a week or whatever, or OMAD one day a week even, like you're going to reduce the calories in that regard. But, we don't have a lot of good long-term data. Actually, some of the long-term, there's these little circles, little groups of low-calorie dieters and stuff like that. And Harvard actually has tracked them. And I think there was 50 in one cohort, and they track them and they compare them to just people who are eating ad lib. Their levels of autophagy are increased just at the basal levels, but they have higher cortisol, increased reverse T3, so markers of thyroid dysfunction. So there's a cost of always being in a deficit, like you're saying. So I agree with what Mark's saying is like, yeah, just have like the amount of food that your body needs and not excess. I think that's one way to do it. The thing is your body really adapts and your metabolism really adapts. So whatever you're doing on a chronic level can be either good or bad. And I like the idea of having my body go, oh crap, today there's like nothing. Mm-hmm. So we got to change some things around. Oh, then there's a surplus this day. So I like the idea of having some variability. If you look at the results of the Biggest Loser study, and these individuals, really cranked down their calories, cranked up their exercise, they had some sort of metabolic, what's called adaptive thermogenesis, which is suppression of their metabolic rate 6 years after the fact. It persists. And one study in New England Journal of Medicine was published in 2010 that blew my mind. Just a 12-week low-calorie diet. They looked at gut hormones, these so-called incretin hormones that affect blood sugar regulation, leptin, adiponectin. Those were all perturbed 18 months after this 12-week study. So, what we do day in, day out, I think build in some variability in there, because you don't want your body to like start to anticipate things all the time. From an energy standpoint, have some little variability. That's just and some of these clinical studies that have inserted diet breaks into a structured weight loss program. So like every 2 weeks, they'll have a 1 week break, and those people lose more weight, even though they're in a surplus during that 1 week compared to people that are strict for 12 weeks straight. So I think variability is good. It's just my approach.
I like it. Yeah, you don't want your body to get complacent. Okay,
Yeah.
the last thing for speed round, I just noticed this lately where you were talking about earlier about the mental side and like just always having to eat. And I just noticed we had a meetup and someone brought their son and he watched the whole movie and was very quiet and just so well behaved because he ate that way.
Mm-hmm.
And Ted Naiman brought his daughter. She sat at the coffee shop for 90 minutes, very quietly reading a book. I just feel like kids who eat the proper food are well behaved. They don't have, it's the opposite of ADHD. Like many people have these ADHD problems. So just what are your thoughts on that?
I think, it's just more stability. You don't have the ebbs and flows and blood sugar fluctuations. A lot of people don't realize it. When you have a blood sugar crash or blood sugar fluctuations, everything's affecting everything. So your brain is connected to the endocrine system, and there's just a lot of flux in neurotransmitters. And so, that's what I find. I mean, independently of this conversation, people will say that same thing about my daughter who's 7, all real food. She has carbs periodically. Like we have a banana there. She'll have a banana, but we exercise all the time. Like that hill over there that folks can't see. We go hiking. It's like a 4-mile hike. We do it pretty much every day. She can sit there and just listen to us talk, do whatever. And she's not banging off the walls and all that. So, and I think, it's important to you don't want to change her diet at 18, right? Be like, oh, you can eat like a kid, have cotton candy and crap. And then, once you're an adult, we're just going to magically change your food preference. Like these things persist. And so even though you or our parents didn't know back in the 90s, like, sugar was bad necessarily. Now we have the data, we can make better choices as parents. But our real food kids definitely are more patient, more calm. They can be in the presence of adults and not drive everyone nuts, but the kids that I've seen, that their behaviors all over the place, they're having a bunch of processed food. They're like insulin resistant, ADD, ADHD like symptoms. So evenness in blood sugar and relying more upon fat oxidation and metabolism is helpful for kids too.
I love it.
All right, buddy.
Where can we find you?
Yeah, my website's super simple, highintensityhealth.com. And then I'm also pretty active on Instagram, metabolic_Mike, like you mentioned earlier. And then YouTube, my channel, High Intensity Health. So, folks enjoyed this conversation. Send me a DM or whatever. Keep up the great work, man. I really appreciate you coming out and checking things out. And hope you had fun in Seattle. And
yeah, it was great. Thanks for having me and getting all your mic equipment out.
For sure, man. Yeah.
All right. Well,
all right.
I'll catch you sometime later.
Sounds good, Brian.
All right, that's a wrap. Thanks for listening, everyone. Please give this podcast a review on iTunes or the Apple Podcast app. Go to nosetail.org and get some grass-finished meat delivered to your door. Go to sapien.org. Check out all the stuff we have going on. Check out the Food Lies YouTube. I'm uploading a lot of videos lately. And support us on Patreon. Thank you so much. See you next week. Stay happy and healthy, my friends.